So good afternoon and good evening to anyone who's joining, or good morning, anyone who's joining remotely. Welcome to this innovation conversation series of talks. Today we have the great pleasure of having Simon Zadek here with us, who's giving us about an hour of his time to take us through some of his thinking and some of the work he's also been doing together with his team in UNDP over the last little while, about a year or so. This is a series of conversation we normally have with, there's no structure to it other than just inviting all staff who are interested in broad innovation topics, in topics about change and what kind of relevance UNDP needs to have in the world, in a fast changing world. So we thought this would be a perfect topic to have Simon here. So welcome Simon. Thanks for taking the time. We do have a few people online. We have currently about 12, and to the colleagues on the line, I would say you'll have a chance to come in and ask questions if you so wish, but we'll wait till the end for that, and you can post the questions on your screen, and I'll ask Aileen kindly maybe to relay them to us so we can have Simon
but only if they're easy.
If they're easy, the easy questions.
I'll filter them for you.
I think we have a small group today here, but instead of sort of going around with the introductions, why don't we just let you a chance to come in, give you a chance to come in when you ask a question, perhaps just in the interest of time. The other thing is that this is a slightly different conversation today because it is a conversation. We normally have speakers come in and they give us some great PowerPoint presentations, lots of slides, and then we have a follow-up question. But today, we thought perhaps with Simon would have it more as a conversation. And probably the best way to do it is we thought I'd ask. I'll start off with a few questions, and then that will go in certain directions, and we'll see where the conversation goes. Welcome, colleagues. And then we'll open it up maybe for some broader questions from the audience. Does that make sense, Simon?
Makes sense.
So, hi, we'll just give you guys a chance to take a seat, and then we'll start off. And maybe, I mean, this is cast as an innovation conversation. So, and I do like the focus we managed to keep on innovation. The truth is, from my perspective, anyways, innovation means many things to different people within the house, very much. So it's that micro level as well as, of course, outside the house. I'm more maybe comfortable or experienced in the sort of incremental type innovations we've seen in the organization. Good stuff, good improvement on programs and some outcomes. Yet I get the feeling that maybe some of you also look at a broader space of innovation. So I'd love to hear from you what your take is on innovation and what kind of space you're looking at, and should we be looking at as an organization to truly have impact and understand and navigate the sort of systemic and system level innovation that we aim to arrive at. Thank you.
So thank you, first of all, for setting this up. It's much appreciated. I've watched a number of these online, so I'm not quite sure if I can match up to it, but I thought it would be a lower risk if we went for a conversation rather than me trying some highfalutin presentation, because you've had a number of those which have been very good. So I've been here for about a year, and probably the four words that I've heard most since I've been here are innovation, platform, systemic, and disruption. Yeah, and they seem to be tagged on to almost every conversation that I come across now, which I suspect is not just when people talk to me, but it's become sort of part of the vernacular over the last year and a half. And so I don't think we want to spend an hour talking about language, but maybe I can kick off with a couple of observations in that space. Firstly, we innovate all the time, every day, every place, the way we drink our coffee, the way we talk to people in the field. You know, that innovation is an endemic part of living. Yeah, and so innovation in and of itself is actually not terribly interesting. Yeah, insofar as it's anywhere and everywhere, and as we blink and as we dress and as we talk to our kids in the morning and so on and so forth. So what are we really interested in as a development organization when we talk about innovation? So it feels to me there must be something wrong with the way we're doing things now. Otherwise, we wouldn't look to do things differently. So there's something limiting what we're doing, and one needs to untease that a bit. And then secondly, we think when we talk about innovation as if the core of innovation is the what, which sort of comes from a kind of technology-driven view that we've got a new widget, we have a new tool, we have a new instrument, we have a new platform, and yet actually most of us who work not only on development but on almost any topic you care to mention will know that the single most difficult thing is usually to do with the how, not with the what. We have plentiful information, we have plentiful knowledge, we don't need new technology breakthroughs to solve most problems that we're facing today. There's ample capital in the world, private and public, to get the job done. So what is the problem? We don't need another widget to solve the clean energy problem. We don't need another stove to prevent health problems inside buildings. The list is endless. You can fill in the gaps yourself. But we're constantly caught up with the dilemma of taking what we know collectively, not necessarily individually, and finding ways to scale it into existence. So I would say, in the simplest possible sense, that we struggle with the what, with the how, not so much with the what. And yet, when most of us talk about innovation, or it seems to me inside UNDP, and you're not alone in this, I think it's true in most organizations, the presumption is, and the rewards are coming, when really the discussion is about the what. So when one looks through the many prizes you've given and ones that you've listed in the innovation facility that you've run, or when you listen to the administrator describing the incredible things that UNDP is doing, 99 times out of 100, there is no reflection on the how. It's almost always the what. Now, at one level, that doesn't really matter, if the how is clear. So if the how is a simple policy device, and then we get our clean stoves, or if the how, is a simple market play, of a profitable product that many people can afford to buy, then the how becomes really easy. There's no first mover disadvantage, there's no incumbent problem, there's no predatory rent taking, but actually none of those things are true in almost everything that we do. So today, for those who can even bear to open the newspapers, we know that we have somewhat of a climate problem. But do we have somewhat of a climate problem because of technology problems, financing problems, knowledge problems, information problems? Actually, none of those things at all. That if we wanted to address carbon emissions, there's nothing to stop us apart from us. It's institutional interests, corporate interests, catch-22s between trade-offs, different countries having different interests. It's all institutional pathway stuff. So that's the first piece of the story. And I apologize if this is blindingly obvious, but it strikes me in the conversations I've listened to over the last year, perhaps this hasn't been surfaced in quite the way it might. Secondly, we are, as an organization, rightly focused on working in countries. And I don't know what the budget numbers are. I think 90x% is spent in country. I'm sure somebody here has a refined number, so I can't claim to know it well. It's a lot. And that makes sense, because many problems need to be solved locally. The capacity to deal with problems needs to be often developed locally. And yet, we know that many of the problems we deal with at a country level, we're dealing with at the end of a pipeline of a global process that is generating the challenges that we face. That actually addressing climate change at the local level in Chad, in wherever it happens to be, there's almost no relationship to a root cause analysis of where the problems really arise. And so the challenge for UNDP, with its extensive focus at a country level, in part, is to figure out how to move upstream to attempt to engage more effectively at an international level. Now, I am a recent person at UNDP, and I understand from what I read and what I hear, that UNDP has a noble and long history in engaging in international processes. But the way the story is told to me is that over the last decade or decade and a half, that noble history has become more tired, if you like, and less active. And it's not really for me to judge whether that is true or indeed the reasons why it's true, but I think we might conclude that there is a challenge for UNDP, not least reflected in its budget, to be able to take the whats that need to be addressed and figure out the hows of working not only at a national level, but increasingly at an international level. I see Owen's here, and he will smile because we've had many discussions about the challenges of growing numbers of displaced people, the degree to which those challenges can be resolved situationally, either by actively encouraging development in originating countries or handling displaced people effectively once they are displaced, or whether there are other ways in which we need to intervene at an international level that go beyond perhaps the classic tools that the UN uses, such as the global compacts that have been formed over the last year. Is there a different way we need to think about displaced people if we imagine or take the projections of IOM and others that there will be perhaps 500, 600, 700 million displaced people in a generation with little prospects of them acquiring permanent citizenship in their lifetime? How do we understand that problem? Can we really address it at a national level? Is it really resolved through our traditional tools of conventions, intergovernmental action, global compacts, or do we need to reframe the problem and begin to think of larger scale solutions? Similarly, many of us across UNDP often in agony find ourselves dealing with financing challenges, not just funding the UNDP, but also raising or mobilizing or deploying finance for development processes. And increasingly, we talk about the need to engage in private financial opportunities, financial and capital markets around the world. And there are more and more of us operating at a national level, figuring out what an SDG bond looks like, or a guarantee might look like, or a bit of innovative financing blended in with a bit of World Bank money, and so on and so forth. The many tools and instruments that we're using. But what if the problem of financing in individual countries has something to do with an obscure regulation that some unknown group of largely men in anonymous suits forms in Basel in Switzerland? Do we understand what Basel III is, which is a set of banking regulations? Do we figure out that that's not our problem, that's something the G20 does, and so we should work downstream and simply cope with the fact that banks will no longer undertake long-term lending for some reason that we haven't really thought about? Or do we as an organization, a development institution, need to figure what does it mean for us to become more engaged in what those obscure, largely guys are doing in some strange part of Europe in creating regulations without any real consideration of their impacts in most of the countries in which we work? Well, we hear a lot about digitalization, and Joe Hooper and others have been kind of building Milli, out of Istanbul and now here, kind of building our understanding of what digitalization means across many different parts of our portfolio. Some of the work that we're doing at Project Catalyst is focused on supporting the Secretary General's task force on digital financing of the SDGs. What's that all about? Well, it's all about the fact that most of the ways in which we think about financial and capital markets today bear little relationship to what they will look like tomorrow. If tomorrow a new global digital currency is launched by a private institution, probably either from California or from the Hangzhou Shanghai corridor, how will those global digital currencies begin to affect what we do in Lusaka? And has the Facebook or the Google or the Ant or the WeChat really thought about how their play into the global economy is going to affect our development processes at a national level? So The challenge is not to stop working, of course, at a national level and at local levels within that. But perhaps the challenge is for us to figure out, of the many, many larger scale trends that we face and that we talk about and that we document and that we communicate on every aspect of sustainable development, which ones are more amenable at any moment in time to intervening in upstream at an international level? Can we affect the way in which digitalization becomes part of financial and capital markets? Can we influence how a digital currency is creating? Can we think differently about what citizenship means for displaced people who will no longer have a Westphalian version of citizenship, and so on? I'm sure we can all fill in the list of the different areas where upstream disruption and change is really where a lot of the action is. And if we don't act upstream, we simply face the consequences downstream and struggle to know how to respond. And then that brings me back to the how. And then, Bernardo, just a couple more comments, and I'll pass it back to you or others. So in the past, arguably, and I'm oversimplifying, the UN had a fairly clear number of tools for acting upstream. Policies, intergovernmental agreements, principles, conventions. These were ways in which we figured we could shape the global landscape in manners that enhance our ability to support development work at the country level. And those instruments remain very much at the heart of a lot of what is done in the UN system, including in UNDP upstream. But arguably, and without exaggerating the point, those instruments are becoming less effective. The involvement of the private sector in large-scale change, new technologies and the way in which they disrupt and change or reduce often the effectiveness of policies, weaknesses in intergovernmental processes that makes it very difficult to create rules that can be enforced across large parts of the global economy. The list is long that tells us that intervening upstream has become a quite tricky process. And so the question of how we do that, as opposed to only what we should intervene and why, becomes more important. And then just to tie it back to what on earth am I doing here, apart from rabbiting away and taking up your lunchtime? So when the administrator came in, he obviously brought with him the language of change, of innovation, of systemic interventions, of platforms, and so on and so forth. All those words that we're now all using quite a lot. And quite rightly, a major part of the way he framed his thinking and has tried to shape UNDP's way of working in that area has been at the national level. So the Accelerator Lab's probably the largest, most visible case in point of trying to figure out both the what and the how at a national level, drawing on the inspiration and innovation, creativity of many actors in UNDP and its partners, and then seeing how that can play out, particularly at a multi-country level. So that's that scaling process through structured learning, if you like, in many ways. And then there was another piece that the administrator chose to create, and that's Project Catalyst. And one simple way of thinking about that is that it's another version of an accelerator lab, except that it's operating exclusively upstream at the international level. So its starting point is not what is amazing at a country level and how can we structure that and scale it and learn from it. It starts at the other end, which is what are the major trends that we can at a particular moment in time effectively intervene in, impact on at a disruption level, and then use that to inform and help our work at a country level. To me, these are two entirely compatible, complementary processes. They're different ways of thinking about the process of change, but they're both formed on essentially the same principles. One originates, if you like, the one I'm involved in, with more of a conceptualization or an analytic view as to where interventions upstream can be most effectively undertaken. And perhaps, and you're here, Melissa, you can speak better to this than I can. Perhaps the accelerator labs rely or build more on the inspiration and practice of UNDP and its partners on the ground. You know, it's a distinction worth making. My guess is if we unbundle it, actually, they'll be much closer to each other, even along that axis. The difference, perhaps, or a difference, is that large-scale interventions upstream are costly, complicated, and time-consuming. Now, arguably, that may also be true in Bangladesh and everywhere else where we work. So, for example, if we want to figure out how digitalization of financial and capital markets are going to change the way in which we can harness private finance for sustainable development, how we might be able to shape those market innovations, how we can upstream begin to influence the policy and regulatory environment that will affect us all in every country in which we work, is, to say the least, not a 5-minute job. Yeah, and involves bringing in many actors who we today may not know, some of whom we may already be working with as partners, and some of whom may be inside UNDP with either explicit skills and capabilities in the area, or maybe implicit skills that we don't quite recognize because it doesn't say digital finance on the tin, and so we have to sort of tease out and bring into this space. And so over the past year, that year of experiment, if you like, we've built a small portfolio of 4 or 5 initiatives, so 4 or 5 domains of intervention, and have tried to figure not a standard way of doing it in any obvious sense, but tried to figure in each case what a 21st century way of intervening upstream might actually involve. And maybe I'll stop there rather than going into the portfolio immediately. Maybe a question from you or from other folks, it might be worthwhile a pause.
No, thank you, Sam. I think it was a very powerful framing. Actually, I really liked how you put that emphasis on. For the longest time, I feel anyway, in my time in UNDP, we've always been almost indoctrinated to hear our comparative advantage is our country office presence. It's almost that physical ability that we have as an organization to transact locally. And that's what we offer. And I think you just really reminded us how that's all very good and well. That's a very important comparative advantage, which also maybe we've been a little timid as an organization in terms of positioning truly around upstream and type issues. You mentioned the portfolio, and I don't want to sort of hog the floor here, but I'm sure that many of us would love to hear more about what this entails, this initiatives that you've been working on with your team. Can you give us some examples of what lines of inquiry and what your vision is, or how do you take a portfolio, manage the risk around the portfolio, and how do you decide what to grow in that portfolio? If that makes any sense to you, I mean, do you look at different entry points?
So let me skip the how to choose for a second. Maybe we can come back to that, because I suspect we'll collapse into random laughter, and give 1 or 2 more examples first, and then we can come back to process. So I've already mentioned the digital finance space, so I'll park that for a second, and I've alluded briefly to the migration story, and so I'll park that for a second as well. We can come back to either or both of those in discussion. So let me sort of tease up a third. So let me start by illustrating. So Bangladesh has one export superhighway, which is textiles and apparel. 70 to 80% of its export value is dependent on that one integrated industry. And of course, textiles and apparel, as many of you will know, is historically step 1 on the industrialization pathway of developing countries as they begin to evolve a manufacturing sector. And we've seen that fairly consistently now over certainly the last half a century. So when I ask folks in Bangladesh, including the Bangladesh Apparel Association, our UNDP colleagues, members of the government, what do you think you'll be exporting in apparel and textiles in 10 years' time? Generally, the answer is quite bullish. Bullish not least because Bangladesh is one of the world's most important exporters of apparel and textiles today, and has secured a position in the global value chain that is really unparalleled, even compared historically to where China was in this sector. But if you talk to a Nike or an Adidas or a Fung Group, some of you will know is the Intel inside the apparel and textile sector, a very, very large Hong Kong-based company, and you ask them the same question, they'll answer in two parts. First, they'll go, you know, Simon, really, we don't know. Climate change, policy change, technology change and automation, shifting tastes, it's almost impossible really to know how quickly textile and apparel's global value chain will change, certainly over a period beyond 2 or 3 years, casting out, say, a decade. And then they'll take a deep breath, look around to see who's listening and go, but probably very little. Probably very, very little from Bangladesh will be exported. Now, that's not a prediction, it's a reflection based on a complex set of factors, if you like, a short series of discussions. But the disconnect is what's most interesting. When we talk to people in Bangladesh, there is an ambition, there is a self-confidence, there's a sense of success, all of which are understandable. But if you talk to folks that are at the bleeding edge of what's really happening to that global value chain, they tell really a quite different story. And if you went round many of the countries in which we work in, we would find comparable discussions. Consider ones that perhaps we wouldn't normally think about. Exporters of natural commodities, of resources under the ground, bauxite. How much bauxite will be needed in a decade's time? How much cotton, virgin cotton, will be really needed in a decade's time, given the Internet of Things, systemic approaches to recycling, circular economy, climate change with massive water scarcities associated with it, complex long-distance communication channels for distribution that are no longer cost-effective. That actually, you don't have to look at the robotization of making shirts to reach a view that our understanding of the role of global value chains in the development process is going through a fundamental change. Now, if you look around UNDP, what one finds is a rather scattered group of people that, to varying degrees, think the same thing. Julia sitting in Bangkok, Caitlin sitting in Vietnam. I'm sure you know many more people than I do who have a sort of inkling, either big inkling or a little inkling, that something is afoot and that we're not really very clear what to do about it. But if you talk to Ma and you go, so Ma, how does UNDP approach this problem? Do we have a set of methodologies? Do we have an analytic framework? Do we have strong data? Most of all, do we have access to the research centers and technology leaders of global companies that are shaping those value chains going forward? No, 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 and no. It's the answer to all of those questions that are the basics of trying to figure out what's going on. How did we get into this situation as the world's most important multilateral development institution? But one of the biggest disruptions to globalization as we know it, which is a dramatic shift in global value chains that have provided the superhighways for export-based growth and development, are going through such dramatic change, and we don't have a handle on what that really looks like, or even methodologically at an institutional level, how to engage in that. This is bad news. This is simply bad news. And although I'm not going to ask us to be ashamed of it, we might sort of consider a little bit of shame when nobody's looking. And so clearly the answer is you've got to solve the problem. I don't mean solve the problem of global value chains, but we need to be on top of this topic, and simply doing a project in Vietnam, or doing a project in Bangladesh, or doing a project wherever it happens to be, each time using different methodologies, different consultants, different ways of thinking about it, isn't going to enable UNDP to develop an institutional capability to get their head around how to help 170 countries in figuring out this extraordinary seismic shift in their development models going forward. So that's the why and the what. And then one comes to the how. So let me briefly speak to the how. As I said, each of the hows in the different parts of the portfolio that Project Catalyst has been experimenting on with others from UNDP varies. So we started from a proposition very much reaffirmed by Louis Philippe, ex out of the World Bank, is that there's no ready data set to really understand this subject. So there's no top-down sort of let's be smart, conceptualize it, junk in the data, and come out with some useful answers. And if you look at the World Bank's attempts to do that on this topic over the last 2 years, you will find in McKinsey style, they look elegant, they look complete, and they're almost completely useless. Because there isn't really a data set that can help us understand what's going on in that consolidated way. We need access not just to a Samsung or to a GE or to whichever company you care to mention, but we need access to the folks within those companies that are driving the technology, that are building the strategy. And actually that means if you talk to Samsung in Vietnam, you're talking to the wrong people, because they don't really know where Samsung as a whole is necessarily going, or they're so fearful of pushback at a Vietnam level that they're not really willing to share what they may know about where that company is off to. So our decision in the first instance was threefold. Firstly, that we would create a partnership with WEF, the World Economic Forum, because that gives us access to the top end of the companies that we need to engage with and build a relationship with, that then can be mobilized in different ways without WEF and at more subsidiary levels in our work at a country and regional level. So we needed the highest level possible access, and we felt that WEF was one way of doing that. Now, WEF is also interesting because although we are rapidly, as UNDP, trying to grow our knowledge of different technological patterns and trends across the development space, WEF, I would say, is much more developed in a number of these areas and has much better access to many of the players that can help us understand what the bleeding edge of some of these technologies really look like and what their likely diffusion patterns are going to be. I give you the upside of WEF not because I own any shares in the World Economic Forum, and in recognition that it's actually incredibly hard to work with the World Economic Forum and not be gobbled up or get very little from it in a relationship. So a decision to work with an organization like WEF is not a light-hearted decision. It is actually a major investment in building an upstream architecture around UNDP, not just for one project or for one bit of research. It's only worth it if one sees a whole process of work with them and their networks being useful for UNDP going forward. We brought in a professional service company, which is something that increasingly UNDP is doing in a number of different areas. In this case, it's A.T. Kearney, and we're beginning to look at some distinct methodologies that we think may help. If I was just to illustrate the point, without kind of diving into sort of the junk land of technical stuff, the only interesting data set out there in this space is a unique data set which allows you to decompose the elements of every product and service exported on the planet. So the best data in the world is export data. That's largely because of the way the UN collects it, actually. And we can decompose the export of a t-shirt into the underlying capabilities that delivered that t-shirt, which is work that originated actually by a number of physicists. A guy called Madero was then taken up by MIT, the World Bank, Harvard, and others, and in fact Louis Philippe is using in some of his work today. No one today is using that approach to decompose the capabilities of countries to understand the effects of disruption on global value chains and the ways in which one can lift out some of the underlying capabilities that the country actually has in the value chains that it's already in, and which are the value chains over time that may be relevant for. So that's just to illustrate one of the methodologies that we're trying to figure out might be useful for us. I won't go further on the example, save to say, this is a case of not intervening upstream in the first instance in terms of a new policy or a new regulation or something of that kind, but actually we have a huge knowledge build to construct for ourselves and a new set of relationships, not just for one moment, but over time, that we need to establish, because any day, month, or year that one looks at this topic, of course, the answer is changing. Yeah, so there is no value whatsoever in us producing a view about the topic and then transferring that view to people on the ground in our country teams to go flog through the Netherlands to whichever government they happen to be looking at. That this has to be a live process, because the nature of the data, the types of disruption that are changing value chains, the potential solution sets are evolving at an extraordinary pace. So the downstream the upstream challenge is the first bit that one's got to try and figure out. In this case, how do we build the knowledge and the new networks to be able to work in this area? And then the downstream challenge, and of course I'll just leave that to Millie because that's her problem, is to figure out how does one bring that knowledge into an advisory operational system without the knowledge becoming dead. In other words, to still allow it to live and develop and evolve. And that's why, certainly in my view, the linkage between this upstream work and not just what country officers do, how country officers deal with dynamic change processes, which is in part the Accelerator Labs work, becomes a critical piece. And although this is just an illustration, I would argue most of the areas that we work in no longer offer us the opportunity of upstream knowledge build and then knowledge transfer for delivery. But actually that way of thinking about how long knowledge functions is now, I would say, largely outdated, because the change that happens so quickly requires us to have the capabilities at a country level to manage the fact that the knowledge is dynamic, not just situational, but also dynamic at the international level. So that would be kind of a case in point, if you like.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Actually, at this point, maybe it's good to start throwing it open for the floor. If the colleagues want to come in and reflect on these questions just given us. So, and also, we're of course taking questions from the colleagues online, 16 people watching. So colleagues, feel free to post your questions. We'll read them out. Colleagues, and anyone who wants to come in at this stage, any questions or clarification?
Not that bad.
Please.
I'll ask
Leila,
a question.
go ahead.
Hi.
Maybe introduce yourself real quick so we know.
Hi, my name is Leila. I work with Bernardo now. I'm on a detail assignment in New York. I'm otherwise based in Istanbul, and I work on innovation there. So work with Millie as well, who's right behind. It's really interesting what you're saying. The narrative is really compelling, and it's obviously something that I think with the innovation team everywhere we're coined as the relevance gap between the reality of what we do and then the speed of change outside. And obviously the three issues that you've picked are highly relevant to the work that we do and to the future of the organization. What I'm interested in particular to find out is, I understand the logic. From a country office perspective, what does this mean? I mean, I understand the idea of influencing global processes and creating this dynamic positioning for UNDP around issues that are new but are fundamentally disruptive to us. But when that translates into the work that we do, what does it mean? And from your own process perspective, are you also trying out solutions? So obviously you're creating the partnerships and the knowledge, but you're also trying out solutions which actually can, to some extent, mitigate the risks of these changes. So
Right.
Taking your example of Bangladesh,
Right.
I would say one of the major issues with that is what will it do to the welfare state? Right, with all of these jobs potentially being reshored, and Nike and Adidas, like you said, they've actually already started reshoring, right? What it does as well, it's a lot of people are going to be out of work in a context that may or may not have, well, actually probably doesn't have a very strong welfare system. So I would say, are you also looking at these like indirect or direct actually links to the process of changing distribution? What did you call it? Changing distribution value chains. And what is the kind of prototyping, experimentation, or is there associated to the work that you're doing? So about 15 questions in one.
I noticed that, right? So let me pick off the ones that are easier and then pretend I didn't hear the ones that are harder. That's probably the way to do it. Let me start with what does it mean for country teams?
Yes.
Which, I can presume to say, but I don't have the responsibility for running a country program, so I can be easily dismissed in this. I think it means that country teams have to be involved in upstream work. That's the one line. Let me illustrate the point. So, the administrator is co-chairing Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing for the SDGs, and I'm the Sherpa to him and to the other co-chair, who's Maria Ramos, who's the CEO Emeritus of ABSA Bank Group in South Africa. Fascinating topic, amazing bunch of people, loads to learn, huge change going on in the digitalization of financial and capital markets, the way it affects the monetary. Interesting stuff, sort of geeky, political, it's got all the makings of a great mystery story or thriller, right? And the idea that the task force can do the work, produce the recommendations, and then hand it to a country office is simply farce. It's just farce. It's insane. Just an insane way of thinking about it. Yeah, as if somehow one writes the book and then just as if it's a manual. Yeah. So the only way that UNDP itself, knowing that it's running this task force for the Secretary General, will not be left in the dust, is if not all, but a key or sufficient group of country teams, regional teams, engages in the task force, bringing knowledge from UNDP, always relevant, always helpful, but learning as one goes. Building new relationships with actors the task force is making on an hourly basis, so that long before you get to the end of the task force, UNDP is already ahead of the task force, is already doing stuff that has drawn every ounce of blood from that learning process and has run on ahead. Actually, the opposite is happening. The opposite is happening, which is it's almost impossible to mobilize a community with UNDP, within UNDP, to engage in a program that is not a program, but a task force, that is not funded with a set of activities on the ground, that is not built with a hierarchy of 15 levels, starting with terribly important people and ending up with terribly unimportant people. And so actually what happens is nothing. Nothing. Now that doesn't mean Marcus Netto and I and others aren't beginning to try and mobilize UNDP into this process, and I think Marcus taking up that new role will be a significant help in that regard. The new digital strategy from Joe will be a significant help in that regard. But as a use case, it really illuminates both the need and the problem. The need is, it's not a relay race. You have to be involved all the way along. Not all 17,000 people in everything. That's not the way large institutions learn. But it's not a relay race where you're figuring it out and passing it down. That old technology transfer view, which I thought we had dumped a while ago from our consciousness, but it exists in Technicolor here. And then the underlying business model of UNDP that makes it very difficult to unlock it, even when any normal, rational, smart person, including every person in UNDP, immediately sees that actually, of course, one's got to be part of this to learn. We know that from the way we bring up our kids. We know that from everything that we do. So that's the first piece. We have to find ways to bring people upstream, maybe the wrong language, upstream into these processes in order to be able to learn in real time, translate in real time, operationalize, and ultimately run ahead of what we're doing upstream. At which point the stuff upstream doesn't become so important. We're not born to be upstream. We're trying to make interventions upstream so that we can function more effectively downstream. So that would be my as you see, I have no opinion on the matter. That would be a kind of a first take. Then the second take is to do with so-called prototyping. And we had this hilarious moment, I remember, in the Istanbul meeting that you invited me to, where Indy was wandering around amidst the how many hundreds of people you had in the room, talking about prototyping. And every time anybody said something to him, they said piloting. Right? And at some point I put up my hand because I like making trouble, and I said to Indy, I think you're saying prototyping, they're saying piloting, and you both think you're saying the same thing. Yeah, and it's not true. Yeah, the development community is born to do little experiments and think then one can replicate the ones that work in many places. That's basically our scale model. And there's almost no relationship to the reality of scaling in almost any situation. I'm sure there are instances where somebody did one thing and then did 1,000 things. Maybe Yunus, in Bangladesh is a case in point. But in the main, scale happens through multiple things connecting together in unexpected ways and kind of bouncing the system to another place, of which only a small number we're involved in. And that often we're not looking for the winner. We always think we'll fund 5 things and one of them will win, and then we'll do it 1,000,000 times, right? Which, again, it's like making systemic interventions is not about choosing winners. It's about understanding sort of the synapses of way things interconnect. And so one's making multiple bets, not to find who gets to the post first, but to figure how to get them to engage and recognize each other and learn from each other and create things that we as the curator could never even have imagined beforehand. But that's how one works with complex systems. So then what does that mean for our work, or the work that I'm in part involved in? Although I think correct me if I'm wrong, Millie and others, I think I'm mirroring things that you and others would also say, perhaps using different language. It means, firstly, Owen, can I be cheeky about you for a second? Is that all right? Yeah, you smile a lot, so I can do that. So we were sitting talking about the work on migrants and refugees that we're doing together as one of the portfolio. And Owen goes, "But where are your prototypes, mate? Right? What are you actually doing on the ground?" Is that a fair enough? Yeah, it's a slight caricature, but it was more like you weren't doing anything with your hand. You were just asking me. And I sort of laughed and I said, well, there are actually a few things that we're doing in individual countries. We're doing something in Bangladesh, we're doing something in Turkey and so on. But actually, it's not us that has to do the prototyping most of the time. And so we're born into a world, UNDP, where we do the programs and we have partners and so on and so forth. We raise the money, we build the project, we execute it, we figure out if it's going to work. That's our model. And that's how we pay for the light bulbs, because we have to earn an overhead, right? But actually, 99% of prototyping has to be part of the ecosystem that one's trying to nudge, not execute. Yeah, and so what one's really trying to look for are the many actors out there that are doing things, and to try and shape a narrative and a process that encourages them into an interrelated space. So I'm not trying to cheat the question, yeah, and I think it's important that one does do stuff on the ground. And luckily, one of the great benefits of working with UNDP is one doesn't have to invent doing something on the ground. There are tens of thousands of people doing things on the ground. So often one doesn't need a new thing. So the work in Turkey is not something that Project Catalyst invented. It's something that's going on in Turkey that we can learn from and interact with. The work in Bangladesh is one of our long-term partners, A2I, where they're actually resourced to do a whole lot of things around e-commerce platforms. And then in talking to them, we thought, how would that relate to Rohingya camps? And I wonder if there's an interesting meeting point. And then they took it forward. So yes to prototyping, but prototyping is not piloting in the sense that I mean it. And we don't have to do most of the prototyping. In fact, it's impossible. However big we are, we have to be a leverage business, not a volume business. And so at some point, our size fools us into the idea that we're a volume business. But systemic change never works from a volume business perspective. Ever, ever, ever. Not going to happen. I'm sure I haven't answered all your questions, but maybe that'll do.
That was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm JK from the Japan unit, BERA. My question, figuratively, is it useful or meaningful to pour new wine into an old bag? That's the figurative question. The reason behind this is innovation comes with risks in general. And my maybe related question is how do you assess this risk sort of mitigation or risk management? I give you one example. Since I joined the UNDP 3 months ago, I've been working with some colleagues for possible secondment from a private company, which happens to be Japanese. That's why I've been involved without my choice. I'm not pushing for this. I'm just thinking about the future of the UNDP. Because unlike MDGs, when the size of the public money, ODA, was counted, for the SDGs, it's inevitable to bring the private sector's resource to the UN organizations. That's in general trend, I think. And that said, my question may be transformed to the following: is it possible for the innovation for the organizations which remain unchanged, or if the answer is no, maybe the organization should be changed to bring some newcomers, new way of thinking, new sort of inputs from the outsiders. But if that's the case, how do you assess the risk? So how do you manage the risk, accompanying with this new change? Is it so simple to think that gain is better more than loss? Then we can go for the innovation, or do we have to be more creative to assess these risks so that the principle of this organization should be maintained?
No, I think it's a great question. Thank you. I'll give a sort of a contribution to the conversation, because I think it's a huge discussion. The Californian tech startup ecosystem relies on 96% failure rate. Relies on it. It doesn't experience it. It relies on it. In other words, it believes fervently, collectively, that if your failure rate goes much lower, then you won't find the innovations that you need. So the more risk averse you are, the less you innovate, and so on. So I don't think we're a Californian shop. I mean, when I look around, it doesn't sort of feel that we're of that ilk. And yet, interestingly, and I say this with caution and respect, I would argue we have a high failure rate, but we can't acknowledge it. And therefore, we can't learn from it and build that into our success model. So failure rates need to be part of success models. And instead, what we do is we bureaucratize and hide failure, and therefore it doesn't contribute to our dynamism. So that would be my first observation. So there's a difference between failing and making it part of a success model. That would be my first observation. My second observation is that the idea that one can turn a 17,000 person organization into a sort of dancing ballerina that innovates every 35 seconds is daft. And so one has to understand the nature of the organization, which is a large-scale public bureaucracy. However much one believes, Mariana Mazzucato about the entrepreneurial state and so on and so forth. Yes, we can be entrepreneurial, but that doesn't mean 17,000 people are being entrepreneurial 10 hours a day. Google doesn't do that. How the hell would we do that? And we don't need to. So in creating innovation around large institutions, the structure within which one innovates becomes really important, because the innovation process has to interface with a large-scale commoditization process. Because all large organizations are basically large-scale commoditization process. They do the same thing again and again and again and again, and hopefully they do it right. Hopefully they're doing the right thing, and hopefully they're doing it efficiently. And that's true not just for public sector bureaucracies, but large companies are basically large commodity machines. They produce millions of T-shirts, or thousands of Rolls-Royce engines, or millions of Toyota cars, and they have to do it again and again repeatedly. If you asked workers on a shop floor of Toyota, could you keep innovating, please? We would have very poor quality, dangerous Toyotas. So that's not right. So one's trying to interface an innovation process with a commoditization process, and you need both. You need both. You're not a startup. You're a large, continuous delivery operation, and that's important to understand. You mustn't lose that identity in the spirit of innovation. It's the relationship between the two. And so part of that, and there are many parts of this, and obviously lots of people have written and speak about this much more eloquently than I do. Part of that is about the proximity of innovation to the commoditization process. So let's take Project Catalyst as a case in point. If the administrator had decided that what he really wanted was UNDP to be a thought leader and have amazing insights that are branded UNDP, one could have created a think tank that was branded UNDP but had basically very little to do with the main organization that is UNDP. So you would push it further out so it doesn't become diluted by the bureaucracy of UNDP, way offshore, right? Or if the administrator had decided that what we really need is to drive continuous innovation in the organization at the micro level, incremental, but continuous innovation, then you don't put the hub offshore, you embed it in the system. That's the accelerator labs. So you embed it in the system to try and actually stimulate a systemic shift in the culture, not just individual innovation. So launching 60 accelerator labs at the same time is not in order to work in 60 countries, it's to shift the culture of UNDP. It's to change the nature of the organization. But you don't do that by having a think tank offshore. You do it by building an architecture at the heart of the engine and trying to trigger a whole set of behavioral and cultural and learning and incentive responses. So Project Catalyst is an interesting combination because it's neither one nor the other. So Project Catalyst has to build processes offshore, without immediately being absorbed into the architecture of the organization. Otherwise, it can't move. So we can't be in the heart. So we're built offline, as you know. We sit in EXO, which is quite unusual and in some ways quite clumsy because it can be alienating or irritating for other parts of the organization that there's this weird thing sitting there doing some funky stuff with the patronage of the administrator. And yet you need something that's a little away from the daily business. At the same time, the job is not thought leadership. Project Catalyst's job is not thought leadership. Thought leadership may be one incidental spin-off, but our job is intervention in systemic change and then bringing that change process back into the possibility of enhanced service delivery to member states at country level. So we have to be connected back into the organization. And so what that means for Owen and Bruno and Asako, is, they'll go, you're doing some weird thing about migrants and digital livelihoods, Simon. Well, go do it because we can't do that over here because we're busy doing something else. But actually, as it begins to brew, let's begin to see how it relates to the new strategy on migrants and refugees developing within the core of Crew, and how that sort of funky, interesting, partly successful, partly not successful experimentation can begin to inform your strategy and programmatic design, the way in which you articulate where UNDP is going, the way in which you raise resources and program it into activities and so on. If we did that too early, before we cooked something interesting, it would normalize to an old style too quickly. If we do it too late or too slow, at some point you'll think of it just as a sort of alien being, out there that you don't really want anything to do with. So to figure the proximity of the innovation process to the rump of the institution becomes a really critical design parameter. That's not a UNDP issue. So I've spent 25 years working with large companies around the world on this topic, this one topic, which is the proximity of skunkworks innovation to the main body of the institution. Whether it's new types of health interventions, an insulin company like Novo Nordisk trying to work out a prevention strategy for diabetes type 2. Yeah, that required a whole different process. Yeah, or whether it be, a social dimension. At some point, General Electric said, we do need to think about human rights, but we can't do what Nike did. Nike just adopted a human rights policy and then went, now we'll figure out what to do with it. And GE, with its synthetic East Coast culture, said, we can't do that. We have to figure it out in a skunkworks model, and then gradually draw it in through a process-driven effect into the way in which we work across the organization. So all large organizations have this innovation proximity issue, and we do too. And we're trying it in a number of different ways. So what's good is it isn't just one approach we're taking. We've got the SDG lab, we've got the innovation facility, we've got the accelerator labs, we've got Project Catalyst, and they're not just trying different kinds of innovation, but they have different proximity to the core of the organization. Is that?
I think so. Still, I will continue to think.
I'm sure we'll continue. This is just
Yes,
a piece.
But thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I'm looking around the floor for any other questions you may have.
Well,
Please, go
I do,
ahead.
I think. So I'm Mats Fritzberger from the SDG integration team.
Right.
And currently, well, I would like to return a bit to one of the buzzwords you mentioned in your splendid framing regarding platforms. And currently I'm working on our forthcoming plan of action for country support platforms, putting in some refined definitions, safeguards, criteria. And what really strikes me of what we have out there at the moment is we are creating platforms that do not necessarily spark innovation. There's just as much of a presence of platforms that make, it's about making connections, you said, but to me, they make very obvious connections. And then the danger lies in the detail in terms of allowing oneself to come at peace with the fact that, yes, we did make a platform, we have established a dialogue, but does that imply that innovation will happen subsequently? Not at all. So my question is, how do we ensure that we can take these platforms further that are created with the help of our country teams and stir the transformative, disruptive, innovative approach that is more needed in the way that we're going towards seismic shifts in society globally.
Nice. How many hours do we have?
Well, no, on the check time, by
No.
the way, I'm very happy to stay until 2:30 if everyone's happy.
I'm kidding. I'll give you a cheeky half an answer. At least that allows people to have lunch or whatever it is they're doing. So like your question, I think it's a great question. Yeah. So curating conversations is just unbelievably hard. We've got to start at the beginning. Yeah. The ability of someone to manage a complex conversation over an extended period of time with a productive outcome isn't just hard, if you're trying to negotiate a new deal in Palestine. It's hard in all the work that we do everywhere. So one's got to start always with only do it if you need to do it. Yeah, so that's the magic first line. If actually you're trying to figure out how to build a toilet, you probably don't need a public-private platform. Yeah, so as many problems as you can solve without partnership, do it. Yeah, if you can manage linear delivery, do it. Yeah, and so avoid the dogma of platforms and understand where they're critical and why. Yeah, and then think about the capabilities that are needed. So that would be my first point, which is don't start with the view of platforms. Start with differentiating different kinds of problems and then figuring out what kind of architecture of a conversation one actually needs and what kind of capability of curating that conversation is required, given the sorts of solutions one might envisage. So let me illustrate. Go back to my global value chain story just briefly. So I'll make it up. Country X, firm Y. The firm, is employing 25,000 people, and their global value chain is shifting. And it doesn't have to be British Steel and Brexit, but you could think about that. But you could think about many others. And there is a government or a set of trade unions that don't want it to leave. It's a game theoretic problem. So the company says to the government, give me a lot of money. That's typically what happens. Otherwise, I'm going away. Or change these policies, or shift that tax law, or give me a capital write-off. The government goes variously, I can, I can't, that's too much. Are you really going to stay if I do it? So this is a real-time problem in any country that we work in continuously. Which is, on the face of it, a zero-sum negotiation. And our job is to get it beyond a zero-sum negotiation into a spectacular win, where not only do they say, but they continue to invest and evolve rather than simply taking the rent and leaving the following year, which we've seen happen many times before. And not only does the government see that it's not just a question of bribing them through tax relief, but actually there's an underlying capability build that they need to start generating in the workforce, or a change in the enabling environment. There are a whole series, which is much, much harder than just paying them off. So this happens every minute of the day, that conversation somewhere on the planet. Not only in developing countries, also in developed countries. Actually, British Steel today, is threatening to go into liquidation unless the government gives them another £20 million, government having given them £50 million like 4 days ago. So it's it happens all the time, all over the shop. Is in the UK, and so in that context, you don't need a lovey-dovey moderator. You need someone that's really figuring out how to help a complex negotiation process. It is a negotiator that you need, that is curating softly, not necessarily to a singular agreement with a contract and a signed deal, but a different set of relationships between the various actors that gives them the trust not just to make a deal once, but to continue to make a deal over time. One of the hugely important characteristics we know of UNDP is, quote unquote, we're there forever. We're not a McKinsey. We're not a World Bank. We're there continuously over a 50, 60-year period, building up the relationships that allow us, if we're smart, to play these kinds of roles over time. And so actually the global value chain work that we're doing with WEF, when they started, what they wanted to do with A.T. Kearney was to produce an assessment tool of the readiness of a country to manage the fourth industrial revolution, which is the sort of Klaus Schwab, want to be a Nobel Prize winner story. And what we convinced them of was that was actually incredibly unhelpful. But what we really needed was a quant methodology, so a rateable methodology that one can use as a basis for creating a conversation about really what the joint interests were and weren't, that would bring out where there were the appearance of a zero-sum situation. Samsung, we are going to leave because it's just cheap to do it elsewhere. BMW, we are going to leave because there are Trump taxes, so there's no point in us staying here. All of those zero-sum, identifying where the sweet spot of collaboration might be, where a conversation actually has value, and one needs capabilities. One needs analytic skills, so one can see what the game theory model really looks like, and one has that sort of ability to bring folks to a successful conclusion. Now that's very different from many other forms of collaboration. Think of the Global Fund, which has nothing to do with quite that. I mean, I'm sure there are negotiations with commercial providers to bring the price of drugs down, but you're dealing with a different set of issues where multiple actors have to come to a common agreement as to how to act in particular domains, not in all domains. And then finally, I would say, for my sins, I have over the years been brought into multiple public-private partnerships, either to run them or to help negotiate out of a crisis. With the Better Sugar Initiative, with the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, with the SA 8000 labour standards. Over the years, I've been brought in when they've got stuck to play that role of trying to unblock the problem. And I don't think there's a magic story to tell, but I think that there are moments where collaboration has very little value. So that comes back to my first point. There are moments where partnerships or collaborative processes have worked in catalyzing people and bringing them together, and then become dysfunctional in execution and really need to be disbanded. So just like organizational theory, there are life cycles in partnerships and periods where they become profoundly dysfunctional. The last thing you want to do is try and keep them alive. The best thing you can do is just help them to die off quickly so that you can get other things going. They become part of the incumbent problem over time, like most institutions do. Public-private partnerships have no natural right to exist innovatively ad infinitum. That's not the way public-private partnerships or collaborative platforms work. So, in conclusion, I would say it is an extraordinary skill to identify, analyze, assemble, and manage a process to a successful conclusion. This is not about bringing people together for a conversation. I mean, I'm oversimplifying the point. And so this organization, if it believes that there are fewer and fewer linear delivery models, in JD's words, moving from complicated stuff to high levels of complexity. It doesn't matter if you like or don't like the language. It doesn't matter. But the point being, where you need multiple actors to work in a synchronistic way, that's essentially what one's talking about, rather than us going, we know how to build this kit. Then we need to not so much be able to conceptualize a normative view of good platforms, but to build a capability as individuals and teams to be able to build these platforms and run them. And actually, the normative conditions that one might go, a good platform, tick, 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 actually is going to be as much a problem as a help in really building out those processes. Almost all dialogues that I've ever involved in evolve out of dysfunction and crisis. And so you can't start with a normative view as to how they should talk to each other or what should be the principles of engagement. You're building out of a mess in 99 times out of 100 and trying to evolve it into a shape that makes sense for the particular players around the table. I don't know whether UNDP has a capability build process in this area. I guess you have, but certainly given, as I understand it, where the administrator with others is kind of taking us collectively, which is sort of more and more curation, less and less linear delivery, the capability build to do that, is the heartland of the story. It's really the heartland of the story. And there's no better way to do that than storytelling, number one. But also, for example, I've until recently been a professor at the Singapore Management University, contributing to a one-year master's called Trisector Partnership, which is basically building capabilities to build and run dialogues and partnerships. And it's, so that we know how to teach this stuff. It's a lot of cognitive and use case skills, a lot of self-development skills that are required. That sort of classic, I don't know whether you like or don't like the Otto Scharmer story on U-learning, but one requires some version of building one's own inner capabilities to be able to do that kind of work. Does that say, it probably doesn't say anything that is new to you, but anyway, there it is.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Simon. I'm just looking at the colleagues online. I don't see any questions. What about colleagues here on the floor? Not maybe one last question, Simon, from my side to help us land this.
Yes.
Catalyst is not maybe something that's meant to be mainstream, if I'm using the right word. But if you look at 12 months from now, what would you see as success for Project Catalyst? Would you see it around this portfolio and uptake or what?
So there are scary. So I think there's a version of success which is Catalyst isn't there anymore. So what does that mean? Catalyst is not there to build and run programs. Catalyst is there to demonstrate a different way of working that to varying levels should be done by everybody in the organization. Now, that doesn't mean every single person, is engaging at a global level with some huge asset manager or whatever it happens to be. But the way of thinking about the how, coming back to that, is relevant at every level in the system. That we see that the pathways of nudging change in complex problems requires a different set of capabilities, a different mindset, is no longer about piloting, is not about looking for winners, requires a different way of shaping change and of validating failure whilst not putting the organization at risk. So coming back to your underlying point. And that's something that should, if successful, spread like a virus in an organization. Illustration, take the Rocky Mountain Institute, which admittedly is a think tank, not a 17,000 person blah blah, that does technology. It was set up by Amory Lovins, who's a genius in everything, including name. And there isn't a single person in the Rocky Mountain Institute that doesn't think in this way, because their entire culture is geared to trying to figure out in multiple domains how to leverage complex systems. Understanding, because they're small, that there is no volume business in this area, whereas we're still fooled by the idea that we're a volume business. We're still kidded into that way of thinking about change. Do it once, do it 100 times, do it 10,000 times, job done. So we see organizations, albeit generally much smaller, who may not say things quite the way I say it, God forbid, but broadly think and act in the way I'm describing. They tend to be newer. They tend to be have a tech link, not always, but often. They tend to be West Coast, not East Coast, if I can sort of draw the distinction, and their equivalents elsewhere. They're in Hangzhou, they're not in Beijing. Sort of same thing, same deal applies. So I've seen, for example, in the last year, quite apart from the specific portfolio that we've built to try and do something, but also demonstrate something, I'm in increasing numbers of conversations that look and feel the way I've just described, which have nothing to do with Project Catalyst, but have to do with a way one thinks about a problem and a process for addressing it, the way one understands the characteristics of the system within which the problem resides, and the nature of our activity to nudge change, the way of understanding failure and feedback and learning and responding to it. And I see those conversations happening more, and I think that's the heartland of success. So the heartland of success isn't closing down because there's no development problem, but because as a way of thinking, this has been picked up more organically in different parts of the organization, and it doesn't require demonstration anymore through a platform called Project Catalyst.
Very good.
Thank you for bearing
Thank you.
with me.
Thank you.
We've gone a little over time. Thank you also very much to those who have survived out there. Hopefully you're writing your emails at the same time. And Bernardo, thank you very
Simon.
much for
It's been a
organizing
really
this.
Inspiring hour.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.